Okay, everyone, welcome back. We're getting into some botany stuff here, and you either love it or you hate it, and a fair amount of this stuff is quite superficial. So let's just get to it, and if you have questions or comments afterwards, let me know. So flowering plants are called angiosperms. Like literally just anything with a flower from a cactus to a water lily is an angiosperm. They're very structurally diverse, but a few things they have in common are the root system and shoot system. The root system self-explanatory. The shoot system also is the stems and leaves, and they'll have three vegetative organs: roots, stems, and leaves. So basically what it says on the tin. An organ is defined as a structure that contains different tissues and performs one or more specific functions. So, like your pancreas is a filter for your blood, and it also produces hormones, and so that's its function as an organ. For roots, stems, and leaves, these are the vegetative organs common to plants, and then flowers, seeds, and fruits are structures involved in reproduction. The root system is generally located underground. There are some plants that have roots that hold them up in the air so they can survive brackish water coming into marshes. But for the most part, their job is to anchor the plant in the soil and absorb water and minerals. And the absorptive capacity is increased by root hairs, and they basically function to increase the surface area. And these are epidermal projections from the root itself. And then you can also modify roots to store food, so things like yams, sweet potatoes. So the stem is your main axis of the plant. The nodes are where leaves attach. The internode is the region in between leaves on the stem. And then leaves are where your photosynthesis takes place. All tissues in the plant arise from meristematic tissue, which allows them to grow their entire life. Your apical meristem is at the tips of the shoots and the roots. These are kind of like the growth plates in your bones, kind of in the sense that they perform a similar function at a distal portion of the thing that's growing, not in how they do it. We'll talk more about how the cells in these areas divide and elongate and mature later. But just know that it's basically a band of metabolically or mitotically active cells at either end for the time being. Your epidermal tissue, just like in us, forms the outer protective layer. Ground tissue fills the interior of the plant, and the vascular tissue is for transport. Basically, if you know this table, that's all you need to know about these tissue types. There's a little bit more here to it than what is listed on the left. And I'm not going to sit here and read the table to you because you're perfectly capable of reading it on your own and taking that at your own pace. The epidermal tissue is generally covered in a waxy cuticle, and this helps to minimize water loss and protect from disease. Epidermal cells have little root hairs that can absorb water, help anchor the plant and they do both of these things by increasing surface area. And there's small hairs on the stems and leaves and reproductive organs of the plant, which is generally like flowers. And these protect from excess exposure to sun, help conserve moisture, some of which produce toxic substances. There are plants, and I forget the name off the top of my head. It was in the news a couple months ago. There's a plant that it's an invasive species in Tennessee. It looks a lot like poke salad, but grows about 4 or 5 feet tall on average, and has this big white flower on the top of it. It has a toxic substance on your skin that on its skin that is cytotoxic. So if you touch it, you basically get like this really nasty chemical burn on your skin. It's almost like acid. And if you get enough of it on you, it is potentially lethal. So if you see such a thing, avoid it. I'll have to see if I can't find that article again. But basically, if you run across a weird plant, don't go touching it, because it may not be something that bad. It could just be, poison ivy or poison oak or something. Anyway, so epidermal tissue, we've got these guard cells on either side of the stomata, and the guard cells open and close the stomata, and the whole point of this is to regulate gas exchange. When conditions are favorable, meaning it's not too hot or too dry, then the plant will open these stomata to allow exchanges of carbon dioxide and oxygen, and allow it to carry out its metabolism, but it's going to be losing water vapor in the process. So if it's not too hot and it's not too dry, you can open these and it's fine and get enough water from the soil. But if it's losing too much water, then it will use the guard cells to close the stomata to help regulate the water loss. Ground tissue forms the bulk of the plant, and it's the space between the epidermal and vascular tissue. Provides a location for most of the photosynthesis and carbohydrate storage. Also produces hormones, toxins, pigments, and other specialized chemicals. Nicotine, produced by the tobacco plant, is actually a rather potent insecticide. And for whatever reason, things that are harmful to mammals also tend to be addictive. Alcohol, nicotine. There's arsenic. There's a species of lemur. I think it's just a ring-tailed lemur, and they basically tick off millipedes, because the millipedes, when they're irritated, they'll roll up in a ball and excrete a little bit of cyanide on their surface to deter predators. And so they'll kind of poke at them and like crunch their shells just a little bit, just to make them excrete cyanide and rub it all over themselves. And it helps kill off parasites, which is pretty handy. But they've noticed that some of the lemurs are actually addicted to the arsenic, and they'll just kind of lightly chew on these centipedes. Which, makes very little sense at all, because, it's literally arsenic. But that's apparently how mammals operate. Ground tissue is found in, you've got 3 different types. So you've got parenchyme, collenchyme, and sclerenchyme. And we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between them here. So parenchyme is the least specialized, and you find it basically everywhere. It can divide to produce more specialized cells. It's they're not quite stem cells, but, kind of in that same vein. Collenchyma is a thicker walled has thicker primary cell walls, and they form bundles underneath the epidermis, and it provides support to immature regions of the plant. So this is like the strands in celery, which I know I've mentioned this before, but anytime you see something bolded in a PowerPoint, there's probably going to be a question on that at some point. So take note of anywhere that you see something in bold, especially if it happens to also be underlined or anything in red. You can pretty much guarantee that's a question. But anyway, ground tissue, or the third type of ground tissue, is the sclerenchyma. It has thick secondary walls impregnated with lignin, and it's non-living at maturation. This is like what you think of as wood, in a mature tree. Serve to support the mature regions of the plant, and they have there's 2 types of sclerenchyma cells: as fibers and scleroids, and they're responsible for like that gritty texture in a pear or the hardness of nuts and peach pits. There's a little more complicated structures in vascular tissue, but basically just know that xylem transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, and then phloem transports sucrose and organic compounds, including hormones, from the leaves to the roots. Because most of the metabolism that's going to be going on, the photosynthesis and whatnot, is going to be carried out in these collenchyma. Just understand that the xylem transports water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, and then phloem transports from the leaves to the roots, and you're transporting sucrose and other organic compounds. So basically, water and minerals from the ground go up to xylem, and then everything else goes down from the leaves to the rest of the plant through the phloem. There's two types of cells in the xylem. You've got the vessel elements, which are shorter and wider, and they're perforated have perforated plates in their end walls. So because these plates are perforated here, you can have things moving rather efficiently from one to the next, from one cell to the next. And then your tracheids, they're long with tapered ends. They're less efficient at transport, but allow water to move across the ends or sidewalls. So basically, this one gets you up to the level that you need to go, and then this one kind of diffuses out everything at that level. The phloem, you've got your sieve tube members, which are arranged to form a continuous tube, basically. And they contain cytoplasm but no nuclei. And that's because they have these little companion cells right next to them here. And the companion cell does, all the metabolism and everything to keep the sieve cell alive and just kind of shares with it. And they're connected by this plasmodesmata extending from one cell to the other, which, makes good sense. If you're transporting, something through here, you're going to need, empty space. But if you want this cell to live longer than 120 days, you're going to need a nucleus. So, or at least 120 days as long as your red blood cells survive without their nucleus once they reach maturation. I would assume this would be similar if the companion cell was to die. But anyway, so monocots versus eudicots, they differ in the number of cotyledons present in the embryonic plant, which is a seed leaf. So monocot has one cotyledon, as the name implies, and then eudicots have two. This table is really important. If I can zoom in here without breaking anything. Okay, so there are different characteristics between monocots and eudicots, and you're going to see this pop up like 4 or 5 times. So I can pretty much guarantee you there's going to be questions asking you to be able to differentiate them. So the most obvious difference is the number of seed leaves. So, 1 in a monocot, 2 in a eudicot. The xylem and phloem form this nice concentric ring in the monocot, or within the roots anyway. And then in the eudicots, it's more of this star-shaped pattern with arms that's kind of like a starfish trapped in there. And you have these distinct vascular bundles forming a ring in the stem. But in the monocots, the vascular bundles are scattered everywhere. And then for monocots, there's nice parallel veins in the leaves. For eudicots, there's no real pattern. It just kind of looks like spider webs. But, they're unique like fingerprints. And then for the flowers, you've got pairs of 4 or 5, and multiples thereof for eudicots. And for monocots, they're in pairs of 3 and multiples of 3. And again, you're going to see that a lot, so I can pretty much guarantee you there's going to be a couple questions on that, so be able to pair these up. For the organization of the root, you have primary growth, which is growing lengthwise, and that occurs down here at your apical meristem. And you've got the root cap kind of protecting the apical meristem here, but the root cap is just sort of acting as a defense here, and then you've got the apical meristem right here, right before this dermal structure. That's where you're actually dividing. So you've got 3 zones here: the zone of cell division, which is your first one; the zone of elongation, second zone here; and then the zone of maturation all the way at the top. And as you work your way up, the cells become more mature. So, fresh baby cells down here in the division, teenager kind of intermediate cells in the elongation, and then, adult cells in the zone of maturation. So we got different types of roots. So primary roots, which is your taproot, fleshy, long, single root, grows straight down, stores food. So, carrots, beets, turnips, these are dicots. Fibrous root system, so long, slender roots with lateral branches, anchors the plant in the soil by growing dense mats near the surface. So things like grasses tends to be a monocot thing. A eudicot is also a dicot. That's just another way of saying it, because dicot, you have two cotyledons. Then we have adventitious roots, which develop from organs the organs of the root system, and they have things like prop roots that emerge from above the soil and act as anchors. So corn, English ivy. Pneumatophores, these are root projections that rise above the water to acquire oxygen, so like in mangroves. And that's, mangroves tend to grow in those kind of brackish, marshy environments where they're not going to have access to too much oxygen when they get flooded. So it's useful to have these. And then epiphytes, so these are air plants, and they basically have no root system at all, or very poorly developed if they do. Typically don't grow in soil. They're usually parasitic. They grow on larger plants, which provides them with the support, and then water and minerals are caught in special pockets at the base of their leaves, or they just parasitize them directly off the larger plant. Root specializations. So you have hostra, or hostoria, however you pronounce it. Uses root-like projections that grow into the host plant. Again, these are parasitic. Makes contacts with the vascular tissue and extracts water and nutrients. You have root nodules, so legumes. Roots have nitrogen-fixing bacteria, supplies nitrogen. The bacteria supplies nitrogen, the plant supplies carbohydrates. So they form this nice little symbiosis. And then a mycorrhiza is an association between roots and fungus. And literally the vast majority of plants could not survive without these mycorrhizal symbiosis. It increases the surface area of the roots and allows for more water and mineral uptake. Usually the fungus gets some sugar out of the deal. You've got nitrogen, like most of the atmosphere that you're breathing right now is nitrogen. And if I'm remembering correctly, we wouldn't actually do very well in a pure oxygen environment unless you're going scuba diving under high pressure. And even then, that's under very specific conditions. So you've got this elemental nitrogen. Bacteria in the soil fix it into ammonia, and then you've got other bacteria that can take that and turn it into a nitrate. And the plant is what actually the nitrate is the form that the plants can actually use. So this can either be done just kind of floating around out in the soil, or you can form one of these root nodules and have the bacteria directly in the root doing it, right then and there. Stolons are runners. These are above ground horizontal systems. And so you can kind of create like clonal plants this way. So this parent plant sends out a runner, and it can either just, put additional roots down to supply more nutrients back, or if it's a good spot, then it can grow and produce a new clone, essentially, of the parent plant. Rhizomes are the same thing, but underground, and this is how another means by which a plant can reproduce asexually. There are entire forests that are one tree that has just formed vast networks of these rhizomes. If I'm remembering correctly, this particular forest is like the second largest organism on the planet. Okay, so leaves. The primary function of leaves is photosynthesis, but they also regulate water loss and protect against parasites and predators. Plants actually know when they're being eaten or being parasitized, and they will alert other nearby plants with chemical messengers, and will some of them actually change the flavor of their leaves to make them taste foul. or can even start producing chemicals in their leaves to act as an irritant to deter predation. Plants actually feel pain in the sense that they can react to and respond to injury. They don't have a nervous system, so they don't really feel in the same sense that we do, but they have a stronger self-preservation drive than most fish do. And the funny thing is, a lot of fish can't actually feel pain because their nervous systems are underdeveloped due to functioning in low oxygen environments. So if you want to eat something that didn't suffer, then become a pescatarian. Anyway, so tangent aside. So the leaves are located on the upper and lower surfaces of the epidermal tissue in leaves is located on the upper and lower surfaces. They have these little trichomes, which are little hairs that can produce irritating substances, protects against water loss by forming a waxy cuticle, and then allows CO2 uptake through stomata regulated by guard cells. And again, in general, plants do photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but in general, they're doing more photosynthesis, so their waste product is oxygen. You've got ground tissue inside the leaf, which is the mesophyll, which is composed of parenchyma and has tons of chloroplasts, which makes good sense because this is where photosynthesis is taking place most of the time. Leaves are composed of a blade and a petiole and are categorized according to form. So two main patterns, your dicot and eudicot. But you've got a simple leaf here. You've got, one petiole and one blade. A compound leaf. So one form of compound leaf here, you've got, your one single stem or a petiole going through the whole thing and then little leaflets off of it. Or you can have the, like going down the whole thing, or you can have them here on another form of compound leaf. You have them all branching at the end, and this is the palmate and pinnate. So leaf adaptation, so the form of the leaf will dictate its function, and that is adapted to the particular circumstances in which it finds itself. So shade plants have these big broad leaves, and basically they're doing everything they can to steal as much sunlight as possible. Plants have reduced leaves, so like little cactus spines here, and they do that to prevent as much water loss as possible. Climbing plants have leaves that have become tendrils, and these are capable of responding to touch. And then carnivorous plants have leaves that trap insects to harvest nitrogen. And again, most of these, the nitrogen bit here is important because most of these carnivorous plants you find in like bogs and marshes and places that there's low nitrogen content, or at least low fixed nitrogen content. So they'll eat insects to supplement their nitrogen. It's really not just insects. Some pitcher plants are large enough to, eat like small rodents and frogs and things. There are some pitcher plants who form little symbiosis with small mammals, and so they will produce nectar. But in order to reach the nectar, the mammal has to position itself in such a manner that its back end is over the mouth of the pitcher, and while it's sitting there, eating the sugary nectar, they frequently leave behind nitrogen-rich fertilizer, shall we say, and so the pitcher plant can use that to grow instead of having to actually eat something, or actually eat a living organism. Uptake and transport of nutrients. So this whole process is done using water transport with the cohesion tension theory. Essentially, cohesion, water molecules cling to each other, and adhesion, water molecules stick to other things. And so this creates kind of a driving force whereby water will just passively climb the walls of the circulatory system in the plant. So they don't actually have to pump the water anywhere. And there's actually a pretty substantial flow of water, like a large, we'll just say oak tree for discussion's sake, can put something like 25 gallons of water into the air per day, which is part of the reason why the rainforests are so rainy all the time. I mean, yes, they're located at the equator and it's hot and a lot of water vapors in the air anyway, but the forests themselves produce clouds. There's a dense fog every morning that turns into clouds and rains back down on the forest that's being produced by this by the plants, the trees in the forest themselves. So it's kind of a self-sustaining mechanism, which is kind of cool. Not that forests are the only thing capable of producing their own clouds. There are corals in the Great Barrier Reef that, when they are thermally stressed, they will release chemicals that can induce cloud formation in the atmosphere above them to provide themselves with some shade, which is quite remarkable, actually. Basically, all you have to do to form a cloud is you have to get water vapor to condense a little bit. So, a bit of dust in the air will start doing that for you. A little too much and it will condense and start to rain. But that aside, for the transport of stuff through the phloem to send, your sap and sugars and whatnot back down, they're using this pressure flow theory. And so basically what ends up happening is you're building a bunch of stuff, in your leaves. So you've got a source here, producer or releaser of sugars, and that then diffuses through to the rest of the plant where it is not being produced, which is your sink. So again, this process requires, basically no active energy. So it's just always going, which is really handy for the plants. The only thing that you have to actively transport is actually moving the sugars into the sieves here. And then after that, water will flow by osmosis. It'll build up pressure here. And once that reaches sufficient pressure, because you've got water flowing into the sieves to even out the concentration gradient, then the sap will just sink down and flow to the rest of the plant. So, but then you'll have to actively transport out the sugar once you get it to where it has to go. So the only thing that the plant actually has to worry about pumping around is moving the sugar into the phloem and then out of it when you get it where it wants to go. But the phloem itself is just kind of flowing around based on this osmotic pressure, and then in the xylem, the water's just going up because of the adhesion-cohesion theory. So very little energy required to make this work. And that is it for Chapter 9. Again, questions, comments, concerns, let me know. And we'll see you in the next one.